Let's only wait the attendees to enter all, and then we start.
I think you can start, Marcelo.
So, good night, everyone. First of all, we would like to truly thank Professor Marc Galanter for the unique honor and kindness of accepting our invitation to give us a lecture about one of his most renowned and remarkable papers called Why the Haves Come Out Ahead, Speculations on the Limits of Legal Change. Professor Marc Galanter is one of the most important professors in the history of American law. He's a professor of law emeritus at the University of Wisconsin Madison Law School. He was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Delhi, a fellow of the American Institute of Indian Studies, and consultant on legal service to the Ford Foundation in India. He was also the John and Rilla Bosshard Professor of Law and South Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin and Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has the Juris Doctor degree from the University of Chicago. He's one of the founders of the Law and Society movement and former president of the Law and Society Association. Professor Marc Galanter has written several books and articles that has revolutionized the study of law and social science in the United States, particularly in areas such as litigation, disputing resolution proceedings, and legal profession. Just as example, I can quote books and articles like The Vanishing Trial, Lowering the Bar, and Tournament of Lawyers. Tonight, Professor Marc Galanter will give us the delight of to hear about one of the most cited articles in the history of legal literature. According to the Social Science Citation Index, Why the Haves Come Out Ahead, that was originally published at the Law and Society Review in 1974, is one of the 15 most cited articles in the world in the legal research. In this paper, Marc Galanter has created a typology of parties that distinguish the repeat players and the one-shotters, proposing a redistributive change through the justice system. No doubt, this is an article that transcends the boundaries of time, of space and time, and is applied in several research around the world, including in Brazil. I also would like to appreciate the presence of the professors that will participate as debaters together with me, Professor Susana Costa, Professor Carlos Alberto de Sales, Professor Flávio Archo, and Professor Guilherme Leroy. And as well, I would like to thank all the attendees that can participate using the written chat. This event is a result of a partnership between Grupo de Pesquisa Acesso à Justiça e Litigância Repetitiva da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de São Paulo, Faculdades Milton Campos, Instituto de Direito Processual IDEPRO, PROCNET, and Fundação Arcadas. But before we have the opportunity to listen Professor Marc Galanter, I would like to invite Professor Susana Costa to give us a brief explanation about the law and society movement. Please, Professor Susana.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this event today. It's a privilege to be able to listen and dialogue with Professor Marc Galanter. In my personal academic path, the work of Professor Marc Galanter was remarkable. I had contact with some papers written by Professor Marc Galanter at a time when I sought interdisciplinarity in the study of civil procedure law, at a time when I was approaching the sociology of law. After that, I had the opportunity to meet him and talk to him when I spent time researching at the Global Legal Studies in Madison Law School in Wisconsin. Professor Galanter's ideas, such as the type of litigants that we are going to talk about today, were fundamental for me to build bridges between the study of sociology of law and civil procedural law. For example, they are an efficient tool to analyze the redistributive potential of the courts when you have inequality between the players. The paper to be presented and debated today has a singular importance in the American Law and Society movement. As Marcelo already told you, Professor Marc Galanter is one of the founders and a central figure in the Law and Society movement and one of the first editors of the Law and Society Review. The Law and Society movement emerged in the 60s in the USA in the social context that, among others, coincided with the era of the civil rights and the discussion of structural litigation and the potential of law in courts to promote social transformation. It is a movement that incorporated academics from the sociology of law, and other social science aimed to study the law in action and not only the law in the books. For this reason, the Law and Society movement often analyzes social change based on social mobilization for the implementation of rights. Also, for this reason, it prioritizes empirical studies of the legal phenomenon. The Law and Society movement rejects the idea that the law is neutral, and it argues that rules and institutions tend to favor certain litigants. For those who want to know more about the central ideas of this movement in Portuguese, I recommend reading the thesis of Professor Paulo Eduardo Alves da Silva, da Faculdade de Direito de Ribeirão Preto, cujo título é Acesso à Justiça, Litigiosidade e Modelo Processual Brasileiro. It is just because the law isn't a neutral phenomenon and that inequality of the players, the theme addressed by Professor Galanter in the paper that we are going to talk about today, matters so much. It matters because in the distribution of justice, players and dispute features often matter more than rules and institutions. And it is precisely because it creates an instrument for analyzing inequality between the hip players and the one-shooters that Professor Galanter's paper is the most cited in the international law and society literature and serves as a basis for research worldwide. In Brazil, Professor Galanter's typology has been widely used in the study of procedure law in recent years, especially by scholars that study mass litigation, a phenomenon in which the inequality of the players is a crucial subject. His ideas, however, have already been introduced in the academic study of the procedural law in Brazil, although not with due credit to the author. In the sense, it's worth mentioning Brian Sgart's interview for the Revista da Rede de Estudos Empíricos em Direito. In this interview, he said that in his first meeting with Capelletti in the Florence Project, Garth saw on his desk a copy of the paper Why the Haves Come Out Ahead. Without a doubt, the research conducted by the two professors, Capelletti and Garth, and which is today one of the classics of the study of civil procedure in Brazil, was highly influenced by the paper by Professor Galanter. Capelletti and Garth developed the idea that the inequality between the players is an obstacle to access to justice. This is a central premise of their study, as it is for Professor Galanter. It is an honor to be here with my colleagues, Professor Flávio Archel, Carlos Alberto de Sales, Marcelo Veiga Franco, and Guilherme Leroy, to hear Professor Galanter speak. I hope you all can enjoy this opportunity as much as I do.
It's I'm overwhelmed by the realization that 50 years after I wrote this paper, I actually started to write it in the fall of 1970, so it's exactly 50 years. And I'm obviously pleased that it has found an audience and is still being read. It's a great honor, I think, and I'm very pleased. And I'm very pleased to be here. It would be better to be with you in Brazil, but this may be the future that we're being introduced to now. Anyway, let me say a little bit about the Halves paper. It was really written in a different age. This was before there was law and economics, before there were critical legal studies, before there was alternative dispute resolution, and it was really before the arrival of, in the US at least, the kind of intrusive legal journalism and the kind of informational opening of the legal world, which I would date, say, to the very late 70s. The first legal newspaper in the US came in 1979. So before that, things that happened in the legal world were much more private, kind of on a need-to-know basis. And it really opened up in the late 70s. Now, this paper was conceived in a age that was very hopeful. It saw the triumph of the civil rights movement, the proliferation of public interest law, many experiments in access to justice. It was the high point of legal in the US of legal services to the poor and the flourishing of militant consumer groups inspired by Ralph Nader, who had recently come on the scene. This is, as I say, the early 1970s. Women had just arrived in the law schools in large numbers. When I went to law school in the 1950s, I went to a very liberal law school, and I think there were about 4 women in a class of 70. So there was a great deal of ferment in the 1970s, and establishment lawyers, I think, found that ferment to be worrisome. But for those of us who ardently wished to transform law from an instrument of oppression to a tool of liberation, it was a very heady time, very exciting time. In the early 1970s, the world seemed to be opening up. Law was being transformed. Some judges were leading the way, and they were supported and prodded by dedicated lawyers who were devising arguments to show the judges how they could dismantle oppressive structures and find new paths to substantive justice. Now, I should say, when this all happened in the 1970s, I was very much a newcomer to American law. As I said, I graduated from law school 15 years earlier. But then I'd gone to India. I was very occupied with research on Indian law. And when I came on a fellowship to Yale in 1970, it was the first time in 12 years that I had been around an American law school. At that point, the legal system I knew best was India. I had rediscovered American law a few years earlier and shifted my teaching in that direction, and tried to eagerly consume everything social science-y that I could find about the US legal system. And at that time, the bookshelf of law and society work wasn't empty, but compared to now, it was very, very thin. And when I wrote this paper, The Haves Come Out Ahead, I was drawing on that literature, but the real foundation of that paper was my work in India, and particularly my analysis of India's national civil rights statute, the Untouchability Offences Act, which I published in 1969, just before I started work on this paper. Now, this Haves paper was a challenge to the judicial triumphalism that was then the received wisdom of the progressive wing of the American Legal Academy. At that time, many of my colleagues thought that it was the judges and their progressive decisions that were going to show us the way into a better world. What this paper of mine attempted to show was that when you look from the bottom up, the US displayed in a subtle form many of the contradictions that rendered grand programs of reform largely symbolic in their results. Now, in the Indian setting, those contradictions were glaringly evident to an outsider like myself with the benefit of no allegiance to the prevailing myths. And I should say, I've always been a great supporter and commender of the experience of spending some time in a different legal system than you grow up with and are trained in. I think it's as I say, and that's sentiment is embodied in Why the Haves Come Out Ahead. Now, the Haves begins with a kind of familiar conceit. You might call it the man from Mars conceit. Well, I wasn't a genuine Martian, but I was a genuine outsider to the American legal system, both in my innocence of detail and my relative detachment. And as I say, I was writing at a time when there was a surging faith in law that I think this paper challenged. And that faith was soon attacked from a very different quarter. Starting in the mid-1970s, important sections of American elites, including its legal establishment, were overtaken by a sense of surfeit. They weren't worried about too little justice. It was too much law that they found bothersome and disturbing. So there was a turning away from law that began with prominent judges and lawyers and was soon taken up by business and political elites who were really offended and outraged by the shrinking of the leeways and immunities that the system had always afforded them, and who now found themselves the targets of an onerous new accountability. So there was this recoil by society's managers and authorities against the enlargement of accountability and remedy for have-nots. And that led to movements for deregulation and tort reform. And although the rhetoric that accompanied it was often very expansive, indicting all lawyers and the entire legal system, the proposals that emerged from that recoil were more patterned, more attacking legal services for the poor, contingency fees, the American rule on cost, that is, that everybody pays their own legal expenses instead of loser pays, attacking trial lawyers and class actions and punitive damages and awards for pain and suffering, and the civil jury as an institution. So we had a 20-year barrage of attacks on those rules and devices that gave some clout to the have-nots, and nothing really that impaired the capacity of corporate entities to use the legal system either defensively or offensively. But there was an enlargement of rights and a heightened expectation of protection and remedy that was really what of the master trends of law in the late 20th century. But there was another equally important but less visible master trend implicated in the recoil against law, the increasing corporatization of legal life and the related legalization of organizational life. So if I were writing the haves now, I would try to say more about the organizational characteristics of the legal actors, because more and more of our encounters and relations are with corporate entities rather than natural persons. More and more of our common life is pursued under the auspices of these artificial persons. With them comes a pervasive legalization of life. And in American society, at least, the sheer amount of law has increased enormously since this paper was written in 1970. And with it, the total amount of legal services provided by a much larger and more proficient body of lawyers. I wish I had some up-to-date figures, but I can just say in the period from 1967, say just before the haves was written, to in the 25 years after that, into the early 90s, the portion of the gross domestic product of the US that was devoted to legal services rose from 0.6% to 1.6%. So it went up 2.5 times in those 25 years, and it's continued, I believe, to go up since. So the size of, but interestingly, as the size of the legal services pie has increased, a greater and greater share of the pie is being consumed by business and government organizations, and a shrinking share by individuals. So we have the increasing predominance of organizations as users of law. That was pointed out quite early in a wonderful book by John Hines and Edward Lauman called Chicago Lawyers. And the wonderful thing about this book is it's one of the few books in our literature that's really been replicated. 25 years later, they went back and did this replication of it. And what they found was that lawyers that represented large organizations were quite separate from those who represented individuals. As they say, the two kinds of law practice are two hemispheres of the profession. Most lawyers reside exclusively in one hemisphere or the other, and seldom, if ever, cross the equator. They estimated that back in 1975, when the first of these studies was done, about half of the total effort of the Chicago bar was devoted to the corporate clients, and a somewhat smaller but very substantial portion was expended on the personal client sector. So you had 53% corporate, 40% personal. Then 20 years later, when the study was replicated, and there were then twice as many lawyers working in Chicago. So in 1995, now 61% of the total effort was devoted to the corporate client sector and only 29% to the personal and small business sector. So since the number of lawyers in Chicago had doubled, this meant that the total effort devoted to the personal sector had gone up by 45%. But the corporate sector in that same period grew 126%, basically almost 3 times as quickly. So we have the increasing presence of these organizational players in the legal system. And I include not only corporations, but governments and associations, all of whom have more occasions to deploy the structural advantages that are discussed in the Haves paper. And they also have cultural advantages in the legal forum. American courts have been very receptive to the notion that corporate actors are persons with rights of their own rather than merely the instruments of natural persons. So corporations have won a string of contemporary cases, and they've won significant Bill of Rights protections, which one commentator has said are symbolic of the transformation of our constitutional system from one of individual freedoms to one of organizational prerogatives. And corporations are also really largely immune from criminal punishment. They can't be imprisoned. The fines are, from their point of view, typically minimal. And we tend to be very forgiving of corporate folly. Many of the blunders of corporations are not chastened, but are deemed worthy of solace in the form of tax deductions. So corporations enjoy a relative impunity to moral condemnation for single-minded pursuit of advantage that, in the case of individual, natural persons, would be condemned as unworthy. Just for an example, relocating your assets to avoid liability. We take it for granted that corporate actors are going to do that. We would condemn it in the case of a natural person. And to a large extent, individuals who invoke the legal system to preserve their rights or forward their interests tend to arouse suspicion and reproach. But corporate actors are rarely condemned for aggressively using the legal system in pursuit of their own interests. Think, for example, of the McDonald's coffee spill case, which I take it must be well known in Brazil, or and it generated a tremendous amount of outrage compared, say, with the sanguine response to many, many larger awards in corporate cases. A number of years ago, I was teaching a class of undergraduates in Wisconsin, and the outrage at the McDonald's coffee spill verdict was palpable. You know, they really thought this was a terrible thing. And I would say 95% of them were quite skeptical. And after my very persuasive argument about the facts and the context, this probably dropped to no more than 90%. So a similar cultural slant is found within the legal profession itself. The prestige ranking of legal fields mirrors the structural division of the profession, with fields serving big business at the top and those serving individual clients, especially clients from lower socioeconomic groups, at the bottom. As some researchers said, the higher a specialty stands in its reputation for being motivated by altruistic as opposed to profitable considerations, the lower it is likely to be in the prestige order. Some of you I know know that I spent a lot of time of my time examining lawyer jokes and their history. And from that source, I have a sense that several generations back, corporations drew more moral condemnation for their misdeeds than they do now. There have always been a lot of jokes about lawyers, and they're usually go on for a long time. Some of them are actually hundreds of years old, but some do drop out of the joke corpus. And what's interesting to me is that one cluster of these dropout jokes are jokes about the corporate manipulation of law. I'll just give you one example. And these are jokes that flourished starting in the 1910s and are pretty much gone by the end of World War II. That is, by the middle of the 20th century, they don't exist anymore. So here's just one example. And it's about a big businessman who calls his lawyer to his office, and he says, that law I told you about is stopping a big deal of mine, and I want you to know if you can prove it unconstitutional. Oh, said the lawyer, that's very easy, I can do that. So the businessman says, well, okay, get busy and familiarize yourself with the law. And the lawyer says, no need, he says, it's the same law you had me prove constitutional a couple of years ago. And this sense of there are many of these stories. I published a whole book of lawyer jokes, and these stories expressed not only a generic suspicion of corporations, but distinct notions about law. that in spite of its air of solidity and majesty, law is very malleable. That in spite of its avowed link to morality, law can be used to circumvent morality. And in spite of its pretension to magisterial dignity, lawyers are hired guns who manipulate the law for their clients. So, as I say, all these jokes were there, and then they just disappear. Well, does that mean that people no longer believe these things? I think there's very solid evidence that they do continue to believe these things, maybe even more intensely than before. There's a widespread popular perception that law's departures from justice are not random, but systematically favor the rich and powerful. That is, those with superior fiscal and organizational resources enjoy advantages in litigation, and that's been appreciated by most observers, and not just on the left, for a long time. Just a couple of examples. 40 years ago, 59% of a national sample, this is the US, agreed that the legal system favors the rich and powerful over everyone else. And there are many, many findings like this. I'll just give you one more. In 1995, 3/4 of the respondents thought the American legal system gives less access to justice to average Americans than to rich people. And 4 out of 5 thought it was much less. So there's no shortage of what you might think of as cynical knowledge about the legal system. It's no secret that the haves come out ahead. Maybe we scholars of the legal system were the last ones to find out. So how do we square these views, this skepticism and pessimism about the legal system with the response to go back to the McDonald's case, the claims of, so it's as if people believe at some level that the haves ought to come out ahead. They're supposed to. That's the proper shape of things. Perhaps that's why verdicts in products liability cases are 12 times more likely to attract newspaper coverage if they're verdicts in favor of the plaintiffs than if they're verdicts for the defendants. So David beating Goliath is still a good story. It's one that's both reassuring, but also curiously upsetting, that people are a little disturbed by that, or at least their expectations are that the haves will come out ahead. Another possible explanation for the demise of these haves jokes is that we're so suffused with cynical knowledge that the notions in the jokes, the notion of the malleability of law, its use for immoral purposes, lawyers as prostitutes, these are no longer sufficiently surprising to support a punchline. A joke has to end with some kind of surprise, and there's no surprise in those facts. So our doubts about the high expectations of law and lawyers against which the deviance portrayed in jokes is measured, our doubts no longer require the indirection of the joke form. Well, this takes us finally to a tangle of questions about the relationship between our growing knowledge of the legal world public perceptions of that world and the way people act in that world? Does our knowledge affect the working of the legal world? Does the effective functionings of legal institutions require the support of myths about the law's moral grandeur? How much cynical knowledge can the public or we scholars absorb? How do we manage to have both myths of legality and cynical knowledge at the same time? One of the curiosities of our current situation, at least in the US, is that the more established and advantaged sections of the population, those who know more about the legal system and benefit the most from its working, tend to be the most disconsolate and angry about it. The haves sponsor campaigns against the legal system, trying to persuade the public that it's demented and spun out of control. So some people are never satisfied, it seems. In any event, I'm optimistic that many of the listeners have read this Haves paper in its new Portuguese incarnation, and I'm very eager to learn how it strikes the Brazilian audience. So I think I will stop here and turn this over to the commentators. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marc Galanter, for the brilliant lecture you gave us here. We have now 280 participants listening to us. And to start the comments, I would like to invite Professor Carlos Alberto de Sales.
Dear Professor Marc Galanter, I would like to say that it's very nice to see you again. And second, I would say that I'm very happy to say that your 50 years old work is now very successful in Brazil. That is very good because it is because now I think our concern about equality in procedure is increasing. That is very, very good. I would like to make a question for you. Is something about technology that I think that is very important nowadays. And I think in a way I read the wide halves in a very simplistic way, of course. We could say that the main difference between repeat players, and one shooters is information. As far as the repeat player can get more information about the law, about the case, and about the judicial system, he can get better results. Meanwhile, the one shooter leaves a notorious informational gap. Then I would like to make you a bifold question. First, I want to know if you think that technology could help to answer this problem. I explain. Technology makes information more available and easily accessible. In this sense, it can be a resource to overcome the one-shotter's lack of information. By another side, I think if those technologies change or could change the balance between repeat player and one shooter?
Do you want me to respond now or wait until everyone's had a chance?
Sorry, Professor?
Yeah, shall I respond?
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Well, I would say yes, technology can make a difference if the problem is really the lack of information. But in many cases, what the information conveys is that your strategic position is very weak. For example, if you're an injured party and you're have to make a decision whether to accept an offer from the injurer, your problem may be partly informational, that you don't know enough about what the general pattern of such recoveries is, but it's also beyond that, you have a strategic problem because you're only going to do this once. And whether to accept that offer or take your chance on going to court, the factors that are in play there are much more than just information. It's that you are in a very different kind of position than a player who frequently is dealing with offers and sometimes and can afford to lose once in a while. But you can't afford to lose, so your choice is constrained not just by problems of information, but by the problem of your strategic position.
Thanks, Professor.
Okay. So it's my time. Yeah. So Professor, before I start my comments, I have 2 comments and 2 questions, if you allow me that. I would like first to personally thank you, Professor Marc, for receiving me under your supervision as a visiting scholar at University of Madison 4 years ago. For me, it was an incredible learning experience, and I will always remember my time in Madison with much fondness and gratefulness. So, Professor Marc, my deep gratitude before my comments. I believe that one of the greatest merits of the outstanding paper why the Haves come out ahead is to create a typology of bodies with an own terminology that can be applied in the past and nowadays in several countries to criticize the behavior of the actors involving in the idea of redistribution through the justice system. For me, it's important to say that the dichotomy between the repeat players and the one-shotter is not merely academic, insofar as it involves the debate about the distributive effects of legal proceedings. So it means that the paper has a clear sociological perspective. In my view, uh, Professor Marc drew attention to the asymmetry of the different types of disputants and how the discrepancies of their structural characteristics, economic capacity and level of experience could bring a potential advantage in favor of the repeat players, including greater chances of success in trials and legal proceedings. So, in this context, uh, I think the article questioned how the unequal financial, organizational, and structural capabilities could produce uneven procedural behaviors between the repeat players and the one-shotters, causing empirical repercussions in the dispute resolution system. Under what conditions can litigation be redistributive? That's what Professor Marc questioned, considering a society in which disputants with different levels of wealth and power are constantly positioned, like you said, in competitive and uncooperative sides in defense of antagonic interests. They like the unequal capacities between these types of parties produces a presumption whereby the haves, that is, the parts that have more resources and have more level of experience, aggregate conditions to come out ahead compared to the have-nots. So at least in theory, the repeat players are more likely to influence the results of lawsuits in their favor, considering that the characteristics of the disputants are more crucial than the procedures or the rules to determine the outcome of dispute resolution. So thus my first question, Professor, is what's your perception? Do you evaluate after 50 years, yeah, like you said, that the paper was written, that the legal system in US and around the world is progressing, is developing to neutralize or at least balance the potential advantage of the repeat players, aiming at greater equality in the litigation system, decreasing the effects on the rules and procedures arising from this asymmetry of those two types of parties? Uh, that's my first question, Professor. If you want to answer now, or I can do later the other one.
Well, let me respond. It seemed to me what I ended up trying to answer that question as in the Haves paper, and my answer was organization. That is, just as a set of laborers, workers increase their ability to strike a favorable deal with their employer by organizing. I think that's the case with other collectivities as well. That so I'm not saying that's a complete solution, but basically create for a bunch of one-shotters to get together and basically create a repeat player which is responsive to their needs. It's not always possible, but there are many situations in which it is. I think the one that impressed me greatly at the time that I wrote the Haves was there's an association in the US called ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and something else, ASCAP, but basically people who write music. And you write music, how do you benefit when people use your music? And ASCAP addressed that problem by having all these members assign their rights to this organization. And the organization could then go and license users And then the license fees were all divided according to some formula about the frequency and the size of the audience and so forth. But it seemed to me a very interesting example of a situation where a single composer would just be totally at a disadvantage in trying to go out into the world and collect royalties every time his or her song was played. But the association provided an instrument through which this could actually be done. And I think as a model, you know, this whole notion of collective action through an association works in many different situations. It may not answer all the questions, but and I must say that 50 years later, I haven't really come up with anything better than there was a famous which I call him, he was both a union organizer, a radical union organizer and songwriter named Joe Hill. And Joe Hill was executed. This is the early 1900s. And it is said that his last words were, "Don't mourn for me, organize." And in some sense, it seemed to me I can't improve on that. You know, it would be nice to have some more some easier answer, but it seems to me that the way these advantages of the haves are overcome is in most cases by organization, which of course then brings into existence a whole new set of inequalities and tensions between the members and the leaders of the organization, but that's another story.
Thank you, Professor. My second comment is related to the application of the article in the Brazilian justice system. Although we do not have official data about the dispute resolution outcomes, comparing the rates of judicial success between the repeat players and the one-shotters, it's possible to apply the typology of parties, considering the pattern of repeated litigation that prevails in Brazil. According to the official data released by National Council of Justice, the overwhelming majority of lawsuits in Brazil have a typical repeat player in one of the sides, whether as plaintiff or defendant. And the typical repeat players in Brazil are the same that you, Professor, mentioned in your article, such as the government as the main repeat player in Brazil, financial and banking institution, and big corporations or companies in areas like telecommunications, airlines, insurance, construction. It's possible to assert that the excessive number that we have in Brazil of lawsuits confirms a pattern whereby the repeat players are indeed engaged in many litigations over time, like you wrote in the article. It's plausible to assume that the constant and regular growing caseloads is the result of many individual lawsuits that containing repeated issues involving a few numbers of or limited numbers of the halves or repeat players. So it seems that the permanence of this scenario is economically advantageous for the repeat players because they can play the odds and employing procedural strategies aiming at obtaining long-term gains and economies of scale, considering the totality of repeated lawsuits. On the other hand, um, in the last decades, it's possible to note that a historical movement in US called the vanishing trial, tending to significantly diminish the number of trials and lawsuits. And one of the causes of this movement is the propagation of alternative dispute resolution. So my question is how to persuade the repeat players to actually employ the alternative dispute resolution, considering that at least presumably is economically advantageous to insist on litigation. Uh, what was done in the U.S. to discourage the excessive and often unnecessary judicialization? Please, Professor.
Uh, it's interesting because I have a somewhat different take on the appearance of alternatives, which curiously are often very vigorously supported by the repeat players, because alternatives, particularly when they exclude the older forms of litigation, are frequently used to stymie the efforts of consumers, for example, to organize, and particularly to defeat the kind of collectivization that's represented by the class action. That is one in American law, the prospect of bringing a class action is one of the instruments by which unorganized individual claimants or defendants can participate in the system. Now, typically, this involves lawyers who basically make that their career and take some initiative in looking for situations in which a class action might be appropriate. That possibility is usually eliminated because when alternative dispute resolution institutions are set up, they're almost always say, we don't do class actions. We only handle claims individually, one by one. And so the possibility of bringing a case that involves significant stakes for the large institution is basically eliminated. and therefore the possibility of negotiation of a serious kind of structural negotiation about the relations between the parties is also eliminated. So I think alternatives are a very two-sided thing. On the one hand, they certainly make it, in many cases, make some relief more accessible, but they also remove the possibility of large structural changes in the relations between the parties.
Thank you so much, Professor. And now I invite Professor Flavio Yarcho for his comments.
First of all, let's open the micro. Yes, Professor Marc Galanter, thank you very much for being here, for being with us. It's really a great honor for us. And I would like also to thank the invitation that was made. I would like to thank to Susana and to Salles and to Marcelo and Guilherme. And maybe I'll try to be brief. Maybe my question is has a kind of connection to the question that Professor Salles made. It's related to technology. Because as you pointed out, when you wrote this magnific paper, it was before, as you said, before the rise of law and economics and etc. It was a different time,
yeah.
And for sure. And I would like to say, I would like to know, sorry, your opinion about the new circumstances, if you're optimistic or pessimist, about, for example, the consequences of the expansion of internet, for example, and media, social media. It's a completely different environment. I mean, not only because of information, because I heard the question of Professor Salles and your answer, but I mean not only because of information, because of maybe the empower people, the individuals are more empowered. If you consider the relationships of corporations. I don't know if I'm right, but for example, journalism. With a cell phone, everybody is a journalist. So there's a different role for individuals facing the corporations. I think, I don't know, I would like to hear your opinion. Maybe it could be a vengeance, a revenge of the individuals against the corporations. I don't know. And related to this, for example, another problem related to technology, artificial intelligence. What do you think about? It tends to get things worse or better? I don't know. These two issues, I would like to hear your opinion about the future, please.
Well, none of us is an expert on the future, of course. And it seems to me that the things that you mentioned, both artificial intelligence and and generally new technologies that seem to present both some possibilities for overcoming the disparities between one-shotters and repeat players, but also, at least at first, on their arrival, it seemed to me they enormously increase the repertoire, the armory of established interests in repeat players, but just what shape, what it will take some pioneering, inventive people to come along and find ways to use these on behalf of one-shotters. I think I'm not. I mean, I tend to be a kind of optimistic person, perhaps naively optimistic, but I think on the whole, the possibilities are there, and we may see some ways in which one-shotters and ordinary people are empowered by these new developments. But we certainly know that the established interests are empowered and enabled to do things using these new technologies. So I just think we're in the realm of possibilities, and I wish I could. I don't know if I wish I could see the future, but I know that I can.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Guilherme, please.
Yes.
Okay. Any other question, Flavio?
No question.
That's fine. Okay.
No further questions.
Guilherme, please.
Thank you, Marcelo, very much. Good evening, everyone. Hi, Professor Marc Galanter.
Hello.
I would like to thank you for being with us tonight. As said by Professor Flavio Yarcho at the beginning, we are here to listen more than anything. It's a pleasure to discuss with you. In the audience here, we have from renewed scholars, lawyers, and judges to students of law, all eager to hear and discuss your ideas, Professor Marc Galanter, that affected a number of studies around the world. I think your thoughts seem to be universal and touch the sense of justice that sometimes gets taken for granted by each one of us. I also need to thank Professor Marcelo Franco, a dear friend and a partner in many projects, for the invitation to discuss such an important matter regarding how justice reflects the ways society works. Today, we are definitely diving in key points to understand the judicial system and how it influences the individuals all around. Last but not least, I extend the greetings to my fellow professors, Susana, Carlos, and Flavio, for sharing and debating with us tonight. Considering the extent to which Professor Galanter's ideas can influence legal thinking, I thought of exploring different, maybe unusual perspectives. As someone not daily involved in the US judicial system or society, it's really important to recognize how there are studies regarding powers, or haves, as used by the professor, that go from politics to finance to technology, as said by Professor Carlos and Flavio, and even the media, help understand the reason behind rules, procedures, and organizations. Personally, I think technology is still in the hands of the repeat players because it's too expensive. Anyway, taking care of matters collectively seems substantially more important to influence change and a better sense of justice, regardless of how hard it is, mainly in times of fake news, intolerance, and polarization. The way the individuals act behind the organizations, behind these repeat players, consciously or not, to maintain the status quo was brought to my attention. After all, as much as they could be part of a repeat player organization or companies, the chances of themselves or their loved ones being in need of the judicial system are always at stake. And the experience of being on one shooter is historically not appreciated. Therefore, why such a mass of lawyers and professionals keep reproducing an abusive conduct? Using lawyers to frustrate, manipulate, the law confirms public interest is set aside when your client is requiring an exit from responsibility. Not only that, it's not uncommon to see them crossing the moral line and ending in a frivolous or vexatious litigation nowadays. It does not seem to me that it's only because of strategic procedures behaviors, but also to maintain the status quo, using every possibility to win, even if it could harm any others. Even in the repeat player scenario, relations can also spike, intensifying the use of dubious reasons to litigate. Organizations and companies can get to the edge of legality, only searching for chances to surpass the competing firm. The shame litigation is an example, as one company used the judicial system to tarnish the image of their competitors. In this direction, I would like to ask you, Professor Galanter, do you see the repeat players as more predisposed to act without good faith, such as the already mentioned frivolous litigation, vexatious litigation, or even the shame litigation? Their haves can guarantee less risk to those behaviors?
I mean, you ask what's basically seemed to be an empirical question, and I don't know any reason to think that the results would be uniform from one place to another. That it seemed to me each legal system has its own set of advantages for repeat players, and some repeat players benefit from using the legal system, it seemed to me, and some from being almost immune to involvement of the legal system. That their strength is that they never get pulled into litigation. They don't have to use it. They're in a favorable position, and they're happy to remain there. So it seemed to me one would have to look at particular sets of repeat players in particular societies, and whether their position was that they were quite comfortable and didn't engage much in litigation, or whether they might be a kind of player that is constantly using the courts instrumentally to pursue their goals. So I don't think that there's a constant relationship of repeat players and litigation. There are many advantages that they have, and they may in practice use some of those advantages or some others. And some of the advantages, it seems to me, are advantages that they have as defendants and potential defendants, that the ability to hold off. For example, in systems, particularly where there's fee shifting, where it's a loser pays system, it seemed to me that many repeat players are very much advantaged, or I should say many established interests are very much advantaged and are not brought into to face legal accountability by the fact that they have this nice rule that makes litigation very risky for one-shot parties. So I wish I had a more general answer, but I think, like to so many questions, there's that rather deflating answer. Well, it depends. Yeah.
But in the US scenario, do you see that the repeat players go more to the edge of legality, or is not that common?
Yeah, I mean, legality has different kinds of edges. One is just corruption and playing the game, quote, unfairly. That's one kind of edge. Another kind is just doing unusual, innovative kinds of maneuvers. That's another kind of going to the edge. And it seemed to me that different repeat players, some repeat players are kind of innovative and adventurous in that way. Others may be corrupt, at least in the American situation. And I'm sure there are places where corruption plays a role, but it's not, if you look at the whole American situation, I don't think it's a big factor in the courts, but at least not on the civil side.
It's not bad to hear that.
Yeah.
And one last question, Professor. Going even further, another issue that calls me out is the relation between litigation and financial impacts of the judicial system upon parties. As indicated by you, one of the answers to fight back the haves, the abusive appropriation of the judiciary by the repeat players, may be to enhance the financial consequences of keeping using it. The United States, for example, passed through the tort reform, the vanishing trial movement, the class action and the pretrial expansion, the reform of legal education, and in the end, kept expensive costs for civil litigation. After observing all those years since the paper was published, do you think the increase of financial aspects for litigants is an effective answer to balance the contrast between repeat players and one-shooters? Or does it backfire on one-shooters, more vulnerable, and could moreover prevent them from going after their rights, reducing their access to justice?
Well, it seemed to be, you're pointing to, it seemed to be a kind of curious, wouldn't say contradiction, but a curious quality of this search for justice, which is as we refine the procedure and we make it more expensive. And so justice at the same time that we perfect the machinery, it becomes more and more difficult to use it, which is one reason why trials have basically gone away and we have settlements, because as we've improved the machinery and made it more delicate and precise, we've made it more expensive. And so in almost every case, at least in financial terms, it makes sense for the parties to make a deal rather than pursue the matter to a decision on principle.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Okay.
Professor Susanna, please.
I can't hear you.
Your Michael.
I think that's the quote that we listen a lot today. Open your micro, because everybody forgets to do that. But Professor Galanter, I would like also to address you two comments, and I would like to listen to you about two different thoughts that I have. In your paper, the White Halves, you start by questioning the potential of courts in promoting social transformation. In this sense, you were perceived as a pessimist, because in 1974, the mainstream believed that courts could promote social transformation. In Brazil, and this discussion about the potential of courts to promote social transformation started later, only at the end of the 80s, when after we had a long period of dictatorship, a new constitution was enacted. Today, we are still discussing that. We have a lot of academics studying that and arguing that the courts can promote social change. But in order to do that, we have to just procedure rules. We still believe here sometimes that rules is an instrument, a crucial instrument to create the capacity to deal with the limits of public law litigation. After all these years, I would like to ask you, after seeing this skepticism that you told us about in America, about the power of courts that grew in American literature, what about you? Do you still believe that it's possible in any circumstance to promote redistributive, just social change through courts?
I do. I mean, it seemed to me courts don't have the last word, but they do have an important word. And it seemed to me courts can make changes that are basically ratified by the political class and by the citizens. I think at the moment we're there's a very interesting question about bail, about making people put up a bond and be released after they're arrested. It's suddenly become just apparent to everyone that this is very much class biased, and many courts and people in the legal system are suddenly thinking about this, and my sense is that we're going to get some major change in the whole institution of bail. And you could say, well, what brought this about? it's sometimes very hard to put your finger on just what's the force behind these changes. But it seemed to me that suddenly the unfairness of cash bail has just suddenly become evident to so many people. And so it's in that kind of situation. I mean, we may get change from the legislatures, but I think a lot of it will come from the courts themselves. So it seemed to me there are situations in which the courts take initiative and can really change things, but it seemed to me that has to be in coordination with changes in public opinion, that, or at least the opinion of strategic elites. So, maybe in the haves I was because I was basically arguing with people who thought courts could just rewrite everything, that I was probably expressed more pessimism about courts than I would feel today.
Thank you. It's good to know that. And my last question, my last comment, you wrote a paper in 2010 about the access to justice, in which you argue that access to justice is a value that is scarce. You developed the argument that when society develops, the line of justice increases. Yeah. So the more justice one has, the more justice one wants. In Brazil, we are now facing, as Guilherme told you, also Marcelo, our own vanishing courts movement. Since we have a lot of dockets, we are now discussing a lot of new bills that will increase the cost of litigation, for example, for unshooters, others that create filters to new dockets as mandatory ODRs. Facing the fact that our courts are populated by corporations, as you said, who often are also repeat players with all their advantage, and that access to justice is a value that is scarce, don't we have to do the opposite movement and take some of these repeat players off of courts in order to guarantee access to justice to the one-shooters?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understand the question. The question is, how do we enable courts to expand access to justice to one-shot players? I hate to be evasive, but I think to some extent we have to talk about different kinds of one-shot players, different kinds of, what they're looking for the courts to do. So I find it very difficult to respond to the question in that very broad way. But I'm hoping that, I realize that the situation in Brazil is one that's very challenging to the courts and to people who want to enlarge the rights of ordinary people. So I'm, I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. I really don't.
But do you because you said that you have a big part of the courts that are occupied by the repeat players,
yeah.
Also in America, and that a lot of plaintiffs that were one-shotters were vanished from the court. And don't you, maybe can't we think in public politics that just create the reverse movement, just maybe equalize the participation of these players in courts?
Yeah, and you know, it seems to me we can approach that on several levels. I mean, one is we could say, well, let's do it through changing the rules that courts are applying, or the other is change the supply of legal services and the way legal services are paid for, which would enable these excluded players to reappear in the courts. So I think the strategy that you follow has to be based on the possibilities in the local situation. You know, it's really a political question of which of these strategies makes the most sense.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Professor, we have two questions from the audience.
Okay.
Can we continue?
Yes, of course.
Okay. The first question was made by Amanda Abud. How do expert systems and machine learning affect the disadvantage shared by the one-shotters in relation to repeat players?
Expert systems and what was the other?
And machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Affect the disadvantage shared by the one-shotters in relation to repeat players. Does it accentuate this difference, or does it make it smaller?
Okay. Is the second question related or separate?
No, it's not related.
Okay. Well, I wish as in so many of these things, I could say, I wish I had an answer, and you know, have to go to that old reliable, it depends. But I mean, I think it, in some sense, it just raises the stakes. It introduces a new expensive technology that requires having your own experts, so that in some sense, although the possibility is there for delivering legal services, I suppose, more cheaply and more effectively, it really depends, again, it seems to me, on the politics of who's paying for it and how they propose to distribute it. So again, it seemed to me there's no yes or no answer. Yes, it could be advantageous for one-shotters, but like, as in most cases, it really depends on the kind of political initiative that is pushing it. Yeah, sorry. You had another question?
Yeah. The last question, please, Professor, from Larissa Margarido. The professor states in his article that his analysis suggests that change at the level of substantive rules is not likely in itself to be determinative of redistributive outcomes. However, as reviewed by some important changes and novelties in the Brazilian civil procedure by the new code, substantive rules, they can be used as an instrument to avoid redistributive outcomes. Based on your research and the change you have observed in the past 50 years, how can we effectively stop or fight such rule changes?
Unfortunately, I feel I end up repeating myself, and in what I hope doesn't seem an evasive way. That it seemed to me that again, it seemed to be, I think this was basically the core motivation of writing this paper, Why the House Come Out Ahead, was to basically say, you can't make great legal improvements without a political base, and so that so many questions about the effects of particular legal arrangements really end up going back into the political realm and saying, what kind of political support is there for such a change? To some extent, I mean, I don't want to completely leave out the limited autonomy of legal institutions. Every institution has some things that can get done largely in internal changes without reference to the outside world. But those internal initiatives are limited by the fact that the institution exists in a wider political context and needs at some point to connect with political support. So again, with so many of these questions, I regret appearing to be evasive, but it seemed to me the answers are really answers that are not entirely within the legal realm. And I think this is one of those.
So, Professor, we are coming to the end, and we'd like to again to truly thank you for the honor to give us the lecture and answer all the comments. I would like to invite you to do your final comments, and then we will finish the video conference.
Well, let me say that I'm very honored to be invited by you and to be given this much attention about a 50-year-old paper. And I think that the questions that were asked today show that, although I think the paper still has some value to it, that there are many new kinds of conditions, and it would be useful or helpful to have a new look at these conditions, and I hope somebody takes the initiative and says, how does this analysis hold up with these new political conditions and new technologies? So I really, as I say, I appreciate the opportunity to connect with you, and I'm very pleased that this paper still has some relevance, and I look forward to seeing what my younger colleagues come up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.